The episode opens in the flicker of a TV screen. A movie samurai kneels in perfect armor beneath cherry blossoms, promising to die for honor with flawless calm. A modern student stares wide-eyed, whispering the word Bushido as if it were an unbroken chain stretching back 1,000 years. A quiet question hangs over the scene. Did any real samurai ever see themselves like this? Or are we watching a story polished until it shines too brightly to be true? We cut through a swirl of posters, manga covers, video game boxes, and corporate training manuals. Everywhere the student looks, Bushido seems to mean the same tidy things. Loyalty to the team, never giving up, working hard without complaint. The code sounds simple and flattering, a ready-made origin story for anyone who wants to feel like a modern samurai. But beneath these slogans, the actual history of samurai behavior and beliefs is far naughtier than any bullet point list. A very long scroll is unrolled, and the word Bushido appears again and again, each time in slightly different handwriting, next to different sets of virtues. In some eras it means frugality and obedience to a lord. In others, it celebrates fearless offense and personal glory. Later, it becomes a way to teach citizens to serve the state. Instead of one timeless definition, Bushido looks more like a suitcase constantly being packed and unpacked by whoever picks it up. In a heroes and villains framework, what matters is not just what a code says, but what people do with it. The story introduces a small lineup: a Sengoku warlord who treats loyalty as a weapon, an Edo samurai who wants rules for a peaceful life, a Meiji officer who turns warrior ethics into national homework, and a propagandist who wraps modern war in ancient language. Each will claim Bushido as their own. Some will inspire, some will excuse terrible choices. The episode sets its main question. If Bushido is a code of honor, who gets to define honor? Is it the warrior who spares a beaten foe, or the lord who demands that warrior's suicide to prove loyalty? Is it the scholar who says violence must be restrained, or the politician who tells young men that true honor lies in dying without hesitation? By the end of this story, viewers should be able to spot when Bushido is being used as a shield and when it's being used as a mask. To understand the code, the story steps back to a time before anyone wrote the word Bushido on a page. On the plains and hills of medieval Japan, warlords clashed over castles and rice fields, recruiting rough foot soldiers and ambitious mounted samurai. Honor here was not yet a printed list of virtues. It was reputation for delivering victory, reputation for not running when others did, and reputation for bringing back spoils to your lord and your men. On the Sengoku battlefield, warriors shouted their names and lineages before charging, hoping brave acts would be witnessed and remembered. A samurai who seized a crucial banner or captured an enemy lord could expect reward. One who fled might see his family's status crumble. Reputation was a currency earned in the chaos of war, and that mattered far more than any neat philosophical sentence about duty or purity. Raids on villages, ambushes on roads, burning storehouses. Much of samurai warfare looked less like formal duels and more like harsh, practical violence. Foot soldiers followed orders because disobedience meant death or poverty, not because someone had read them a code about the purity of sacrifice. When we later read beautiful lines about Bushido, we must remember they were written after centuries of blood had already soaked the fields. Early texts sometimes used phrases like the way of the warrior to praise loyalty, bravery, and disdain for luxury. But they were not yet a unified manual that all samurai agreed on. They were hints and opinions, the way players in a rough sport begin to talk about what a real player should be like long before any rulebook is published. By the end of the first act, two images come into focus: messy, practical warrior life filled with deals and betrayals, and tidy words that claim to express the warrior's true way. The heart of the Bushido story lies in the gap between those two. Every era will try to shrink that gap, insisting that its favorite version is the real one. The key is to keep asking who benefits when Bushido is defined in a particular way. In the Warring States era, daimyo built and broke alliances with dizzying speed. A retainer could be praised one year for destroying a rival and killed the next for backing the wrong side. Soldiers fought for stipends, plunder, and survival, not yet for a sacred abstraction called Bushido. If there was a code, it boiled down to: be useful to your lord, win, and don't be on the losing team when the dust settles. Samurai status depended on land and rice grants, which in turn depended on pleasing a lord. Castles were not just dramatic backdrops, they were accounting centers for grain, loyalty, and punishment. A warrior who held a gate at the right moment might see his stipend increase, while one who arrived late could watch his household shrink with every angry brushstroke in the records. Stories from the Sengoku period are full of stunning loyalty and equally stunning betrayal. A general might risk everything for his lord, only to defect later when that lord seemed doomed. Samurai chroniclers praised some of these switches as wise, condemned others as treacherous. Even here, loyalty was not a simple line. It was a negotiation between survival, ambition, and reputation. For low-ranking Ashigaru, high-flown talk of honor rarely mattered. They hauled equipment, guarded supplies, and marched in straw sandals through rain and mud. If they fled too soon, they might be executed as cowards. If they died bravely, their families might receive a small bonus. Their version of the warrior's way was practical. Stand where you're told, try not to starve, and hope your lord dies old enough that you're not buried with him. Sengoku tales praise warriors who challenged enemies to duels in the chaos of battle, using poetry and bold speeches to make their actions memorable. These moments were like viral clips before cameras existed, carefully staged, witnessed by many, and retold often. Yet, behind every polished anecdote stood 100 silent acts of killing that no one bothered to romanticize. Buddhist temples and wandering monks sometimes advised warriors, preaching the impermanence of life and the need to face death calmly. For a samurai who could be ordered into a suicidal charge at any moment, such teachings offered a framework to accept risk. But this was spiritual therapy, not yet a unified Bushido syllabus. Different sects and teachers gave different answers. We do find early examples of warriors choosing death over capture or humiliation. But for every famous last stand, many other samurai negotiated surrender, changed sides, or fled to fight another day. The slogan, "Death before dishonor," was an ideal people reached for. Not a constant rule everyone followed. Already we see the gap between inspiring story and messy reality. Through generations of conflict, powerful leaders gradually unified Japan under a central authority. When the greatest wars ended, the practical incentives for constant battlefield heroics declined. A warrior class built for fighting suddenly had to live in a system that needed administrators, tax collectors, and polite officials more than raiders and duelists. By the time peace took hold, samurai meant not just active fighters but an entire status group. Many would never fight a major battle in their lives, yet they still carried swords and stipends. A new question emerged. What does it mean to be a warrior when there are no wars left to prove yourself in? As the Sengoku age ends, one idea stands out. Samurai identity was forged in brutal, practical conflict, not in libraries. In the next act, the focus shifts to the people who tried to freeze that chaos into ink, deciding which parts of the warrior past deserve to be called the true way. The pen, for a time, becomes sharper than the sword. Under the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan enjoyed long internal peace. Samurai now served as clerks, magistrates, and guards more than as frontline warriors. They attended poetry gatherings, arranged marriages, and worried about stipends. In this world, the proudly violent past could be both embarrassing and inspiring. Many felt a need to explain what made them special now that they were more bureaucrat than berserker. Confucian scholars in the Edo period saw samurai as potential moral leaders of society. They wrote about how a warrior should be loyal, honest, self-controlled, and well-read. Their ideal samurai was as much a civil servant and role model as a fighter. In their writings, we see the first attempts to build a complete philosophical way for the warrior class. Text after text appeared describing an idealized samurai. Brave in danger, humble in peace, frugal with money, strict with himself, but gentle with the weak. These works did not all agree, but together they began to turn scattered virtues into a toolkit. The name Bushido was now tied to a bookshelf, not just a battlefield rumor. One famous text, later called Hagakure, claimed that the way of the samurai is found in death. It praised readiness to die at any moment as the core virtue. Yet the man who dictated these words lived out his life in relative safety, and many contemporaries thought his ideas extreme. Even in Edo times, there was debate about how deadly Bushido should really be. For many Edo samurai, living the code meant showing proper etiquette, paying respects to superiors, and managing household debts with dignity. Some were poor, selling heirloom armor or secretly teaching side jobs to stay afloat. Their Bushido looked less like sudden heroic sacrifice and more like enduring boredom, frustration, and financial pressure without losing face. In dojos across Japan, sword and spear practice doubled as moral theater. Students were taught to bow properly, control their tempers, and accept correction without complaint. The forms they drilled were as much about internal posture as external technique. Here, the idea that the warrior's way is about perfecting oneself, not just killing well, took root in daily muscle memory. Edo writers combed earlier war tales, picking out episodes that fit their moral vision. They highlighted last stands, loyal deaths, and noble refusals to betray one's lord. Awkward stories of opportunistic switches or brutal village burnings quietly faded into the background. The samurai past became a curated museum where only certain exhibits were left in the main hall. Over time, being a samurai meant being expected to live up to this printed ideal, even if your actual job involved checking rice measurements or settling neighborhood disputes. The warrior's way became a brand, a promise that this class, even in peacetime, embodied certain virtues. Bushido was starting to serve not just samurai identity, but social stability. Of course, not every samurai lived up to the code. Drunken brawls, corruption, and cruelty appear in records too. Satirical plays and stories poked fun at pompous officials who preached virtue while chasing bribes. Even in the era when Bushido was most elegantly described, real life kept leaking around the edges of the ideal. By the close of Edo, Bushido had become a recognizable term and a set of ideas, if not a single agreed-upon manual. It wrapped the warrior class in language that made sense for a peaceful, ordered society. Next comes the moment when that language is picked up, shaken hard, and poured into a brand new bottle, the modern nation-state. When the Meiji Restoration toppled the shogunate, leaders needed to build a modern state fast. They abolished the samurai class on paper, yet they still wanted the aura of samurai courage and discipline. Instead of disappearing, Bushido was invited to move from castle halls into barracks, schools, and government speeches. Meiji ideologues spoke of a unique Japanese spirit that could match Western cannons and railroads. They reached for samurai stories to give that spirit a face, presenting Bushido as the timeless backbone of the nation. What had once separated a warrior class from peasants now became something all citizens were supposed to emulate, at least in rhetoric. Textbooks for Meiji schoolchildren featured simplified tales of loyal retainers, fearless last stands, and self-sacrificing warriors. The messy parts like betrayals, peasant suffering, and class privilege were left out or softened. For a new generation, Bushido meant not estate management and complicated politics, but clean diagrams of how to be brave and obedient. In army training grounds, officers used Bushido language to link recruits to a glorious past. Recruits were told they inherited the spirit of ancient warriors and must never shame that lineage. While drills focused on rifles and modern tactics, the speeches wrapped these techniques in samurai-flavored honor talk. Industrialization jumbled old social hierarchies, sending farmers to factories and samurai descendants into business or bureaucracy. Bushido talk helped leaders promise continuity in the midst of rapid change. You might not wear armor anymore, they said, but you could still be samurai-like in your job, your classroom, and your willingness to put the group above yourself. Authors in the late 19th and early 20th centuries published books explaining Bushido to Western audiences, sometimes smoothing out complexities to impress foreign readers. They presented the code as Japan's noble equivalent to medieval chivalry, emphasizing self-control and noble sacrifice. These works fed overseas fantasies, while also reinforcing domestic pride. As Japan fought modern wars against China and Russia, newspapers and posters described soldiers as new samurai. Medals and pensions replaced land grants, but the language of Bushido tied these unfamiliar battleships and trenches back to ancestral courage. Heroes now wore wool and steel, not silk and lacquer. Yet the story claimed their inner code was the same. Trenches, artillery shells, and disease did not care about honor codes. In real campaigns, soldiers worried about mud, hunger, fear, and confusing orders. For them, Bushido speeches sometimes felt inspiring, and sometimes like distant noise. The gap between the proud words and the chaotic front lines grew wider with each conflict. By the early 20th century, Bushido had become more than a samurai ethic. It was a national story that could be used to motivate students, office workers, and soldiers alike. In the next act, that versatility becomes dangerous when a militarized state decides that the highest expression of the code is not just living well, but dying on command. In the 1930s, as Japan moved deeper into militarism, Bushido language intensified. Propagandists and officers called on citizens to be ready for hardship and sacrifice, insisting that true Japanese character meant dying fearlessly for emperor and country. The code that once tried to govern samurai behavior now hovered over everyone, like a sharp, invisible sword. Schoolchildren repeated more aggressive versions of Bushido-themed lessons. Never shame your family, always obey orders, accept death if needed. Stories of compassionate or conflicted samurai faded, replaced by tales of ruthless determination. Nuance was sanded away so that the code could serve as a simple on-off switch. You were either loyal unto death or disloyal entirely. Army propaganda insisted that every soldier carried the spirit of the samurai under his khaki uniform. Training manuals and speeches claimed that any hesitation or survival instinct was a betrayal of ancient ancestors. The messy human fears seen on Sengoku battlefields were pushed aside in favor of a single, relentless image of the warrior as a willing martyr. Bushido phrases were sometimes twisted to justify harsh treatment of prisoners and occupied peoples. The enemy was portrayed as lesser, lacking true honor, so cruelty could be framed as righteous. The code that once aimed to restrain warriors risked becoming a tool to remove restraints instead, especially when filtered through racism and wartime fear. In the final stages of the war, special attack units were formed, and pilots were praised for willingly dying in suicide missions. Bushido language about embracing death and never surrendering was invoked to frame these acts as the highest form of warrior virtue. But behind the speeches were young men under enormous pressure, some deeply conflicted about what they were asked to do. A natural question arises. What happens when any ethical code is welded entirely to a state's war goals? The answer is that virtues like courage and loyalty can be used to encourage acts that might otherwise be questioned. In this era, Bushido became less about how to be a good person and more about how to be an unbreakable tool. With Japan's defeat, many survivors struggled to reconcile what they had been told with what they had seen. Some felt betrayed by leaders who had used Bushido language to justify hopeless campaigns. Others clung to the ideals but rejected the way the state had twisted them. The code's image cracked, revealing deep fault lines beneath the polished surface. Allied reports and post-war books often describe Japanese soldiers as fanatical samurai heirs, emphasizing the Bushido angle to explain fierce resistance. These narratives sometimes ignored the diversity of experiences and opinions within Japan. The result was a simplified picture where Bushido looked like an unstoppable ancient force, rather than something recently reshaped and aggressively taught. By the mid-20th century, Bushido was both revered and blamed, praised in some circles as a source of strength, condemned in others as fuel for war crimes. Next comes the phase where the code is cleaned up, repackaged, and sold again, this time not for empire, but for personal growth, pop culture, and corporate life. After the war, many veterans rarely spoke openly about Bushido or their experiences. Some felt shame, others grief, and others simply exhaustion. The code did not vanish, but for a while it retreated into private memories, prayer halls, and cautious academic discussions. Publicly, the priority was rebuilding homes and lives. In the following decades, novelists and manga artists returned to samurai stories, this time with more room for complexity. Some works questioned rigid honor codes, showing tragic consequences of blind loyalty. Others kept the heroics, but placed them in clearly fictional worlds. Bushido re-entered popular culture wearing costumes of nostalgia, critique, or pure entertainment. Business and sports writers adopted Bushido as a metaphor for dedication and teamwork. Self-help books encouraged readers to adopt a samurai mindset to survive long hours or tough competition. In these contexts, the darker parts of the code-rigid hierarchy, readiness for death, were softened or ignored, while perseverance and discipline were spotlighted. Around the world, fans of martial arts and anime embraced Bushido as a kind of cool, exotic, knightly code. Many adopted symbols and slogans with enthusiasm, sometimes without knowing the term's more recent political uses. For them, Bushido meant fairness in sparring, respect for teachers, and stylish poses with swords more than national ideology. Historians and sociologists began to unpack the layers of Bushido, pointing out how much of it was shaped in the Edo and modern periods rather than being ancient and unchanging. Their work complicated popular stories but offered a more honest picture. For viewers willing to listen, Bushido became not a relic but a case study in how societies invent and recycle tradition. Many individuals still find genuine inspiration in parts of the Bushido story: the courage to face fear, the commitment to improve oneself, the duty to protect others. When chosen freely and critically, these elements can help people navigate hardship. The danger appears when someone insists that only one version of Bushido is legitimate, and that everyone must follow it. At the same time, survivors and scholars urge us not to forget how Bushido language contributed to wartime atrocities. They argue that any code can become harmful when it stops allowing questions. Remembering those episodes isn't about rejecting all versions of the warrior's way, but about keeping a clear eye on what happens when virtues are weaponized. The journey of Bushido runs from battlefields to bureaucrats, from schoolrooms to suicide missions, from anime covers to scholarly debates. In the final act, the story steps back to ask what this path tells us about heroes, villains, and the stories we tell about how we should live. A code is never just words, it is always a stage where real choices are made. Not every hero of Bushido history is the one who obeys without hesitation. Some of the most admirable figures are those who used the code to protect the vulnerable or who refused orders that twisted its spirit beyond recognition. An Edo samurai refusing to murder innocents, a soldier sparing prisoners despite propaganda. These people show that real courage often involves resisting the worst uses of tradition. The villains in this story are not those who talk about courage or loyalty in themselves, but those who use such words to demand blind obedience, erase inconvenient facts, or justify cruelty. They wrap themselves in Bushido the way a con artist wears a fake uniform hoping people will salute first and ask questions never. Bushido is easier to understand as a mirror than as a stone tablet. Each era holds it up and sees its own hopes and fears reflected back. Warlords see valor and cunning, Edo scholars see order and responsibility, militarists see obedient sacrifice, modern fans see stylish discipline. The code tells us as much about the beholder as about some fixed ancient truth. Modern creators and audiences have the power to choose which Bushido stories to foreground. Do we repeat only the tales of glorious death and total obedience, or do we also highlight those of mercy, integrity, and wise restraint? The code's future shape will depend on what we reward with attention, memes, and screen time. One key lesson of Bushido's history is that any ethic becomes dangerous when it cannot be questioned. Once people are told that real loyalty means never doubting orders, the door opens to abuse. The courage to ask why and who benefits is as important as the courage to endure hardship. Stripped of romantic armor and nationalist slogans, some Bushido ideas resemble ordinary virtues. Keep your word, take responsibility, try to be brave and fair. The real challenge is to practice these in small, unglamorous situations, owning up to mistakes at work, standing up for a bullied classmate, not only in fantasies of dramatic last stands. The lineup returns. The Sengoku warlord whose world taught him that survival justified brutal choices. The Edo samurai trying to be dignified in peace. The Meiji officer stitching old language onto a new flag. The propagandist twisting the code for power, and the modern student wondering what to keep and what to discard. None of them is pure hero or villain, but their choices show how Bushido can tilt in either direction. The most revealing figures in Bushido's story stand at crossroads of power and belief. Leaders deciding what to ask of their followers, followers deciding how far to obey, thinkers deciding which paths to emphasize. Judging them involves looking not just at their bravery, but at what their bravery served. The same code can produce guardians or executioners depending on which path they choose. By now, Bushido is no longer just a mysterious word from another culture or a dramatic flourish in movies. It has become an example of how any society can write, rewrite, and weaponize ideals. The real question is what each person will do when handed a story about how they ought to live. Will it be repeated as is or examined, adapted, and stripped of its worst demands? The story closes with this. Bushido is not a magic phrase that turns people into saints or monsters. It is a long, contested conversation about honor, duty, and sacrifice that has been used to inspire, control, comfort, and harm. Seeing how different eras turn the samurai code into different tools teaches us to treat all big ideals with both respect and healthy suspicion, and to remember that the bravest part of any code is the human being who chooses how to live it.